Lyft is testing a new version of primetime for drivers based on fixed dollar amounts instead of the long-standing percentage model. And this has a lot of drivers concerned about the future of primetime. Joe here with the Rideshare Guy, and today we're going to discuss Lyft's new primetime experiment. So the idea isn't new. Uber actually initiated the idea of fixed dollar surge amounts near the end of last year. And Lyft's new version of primetime, they call it heat maps, is a lot like power zones. Basically in that you have to drive to the zone, to a geofenced area in order to qualify for the bonus. With power zones, you're guaranteed a certain percentage, but with heat maps, you'll be guaranteed a fixed dollar amount. And it's probably going to take some getting used to, but with this new heat map experience, you'll no longer see primetime or power zones. Instead, you'll see purple and pink zones with fixed dollar amount offers like these. And these purple and pink zones are strictly location based. You will only see them when you're near them. And again, you'll no longer see prime time, so you won't be able to assess the overall demand throughout your city. And just like power zones, you need to be physically located inside the zone when a request is made in order to receive the bonus amount. Mark recently wrote a guest post about his experience of the new Lyft heat map experiment in Chicago over at therideshareguy.com. So Lyft actually sent him an email letting him know that he'd be one of the first drivers to test the new version of primetime. So it was actually completely involuntary, and many other drivers in his market were involuntarily entered as well. But on Monday morning of that week, this is what his view of the Lyft driver app looked like versus what his view of the Uber app looked like. You can see Uber is lit up like a Christmas tree with surge, and Lyft showed literally zero prime time. Based on his location, he wasn't offered any of the new heat zones, and again, those heat zones are strictly location based, so you have to be located near them in order to see them. And again, he can't see you can no longer see prime time, so you're not able to assess the overall demand throughout the city any longer. And it seems like Lyft's execution was pretty poor. Since it was an involuntary trial, a lot of drivers were opening up their driver app Monday morning and were confused because they were seeing literally zero prime time. Lyft probably could have done a better job of communicating to these drivers what the app would look like under the new heat map structure. But on Tuesday, Mark was located near downtown Chicago, and he saw these heat zones for the first time. Again, he was offered the zones based on his location. He ended up giving 9 total rides that evening, and a handful of those rides came from the new heat zones. And the bonus amounts for each of those rides were anywhere from fixed dollar amounts, anywhere from $8 to $10. He ended up making about $100 that night in just about 2.5 hours, which equates to about $40 an hour. Not a bad night's work. And on Friday, he saw a major downside to the trial. So there's the new heat zone structure, which he was a part of, but there's still prime time for drivers. So some drivers were under the heat zone structure, and some drivers were still under prime time. So prime time was still occurring all throughout the city, and it seemed like the prime time wasn't consistent with the heat zones. So there were times where passengers were paying a prime time rate on, say, the outskirts of the city, and the driver that was in the trial was not actually receiving prime time for that ride since there wasn't a zone offered. So essentially that passenger may have been paying a prime time rate, and the driver wasn't receiving the same rate, essentially pretty much stealing that driver's prime time. Here you can see what Mark saw versus what a driver friend of his not in the experiment saw at the exact same time. Mark was surrounded by prime time, yet no heat zones were offered to him. Another time, Mark was located near Wrigley Field at the completion of a Cubs game. And he again compared his driver app to the app of his driver friend who was not in the experiment, and he could see that clearly prime time was in play, but Mark was not being offered any of the heat zones. Mark ended up giving a flat rate ride, but here's what he saw when he looked at the ride receipt. Clearly the passenger had paid a prime time rate, and that rate was not passed on to Mark. And for further confirmation, here's a screenshot of another driver that was again not in the new heat zone experiment that gave a ride from the Wrigley area around the same time as Mark. You can see it was over a 200% primetime fare. Also at the airport, Mark found that drivers in the trial were not being offered these heat zones when clearly primetime was in play there as well. Here's a look at a few screenshots. The first 2 images are from a driver in the test group, and the last one is from a driver who is still under the old version of primetime. You can see primetime was in play, but there were no heat zones offered to drivers that were in the trial group. Overall, you can see that the execution for this trial in Chicago was pretty poor. because drivers in the new trial, the new heat map structure, were still able to compare with drivers that were still under the old prime time. They were able to compare and see that the actual prime time demand was not consistent with how these heat zones were being offered. And Lyft actually, I think they understood this, because about not even a week after Mark actually published his article, they ended up pausing the new heat zone experiment in Chicago. But as far as the specifics as to exactly how these heat zones will work, basically with these new fixed dollar amounts, it makes more sense to give a lot of short rides in your downtown areas where these heat zones are being offered, as opposed to the long rides. Those rides, those unicorn rides where you'd get a long ride during a high prime time, say a 200% or 300% prime time ride that was 20 plus miles, instead of getting paid that 200% prime time, you're only going to get paid a fixed dollar amount. You could get paid, say, a fixed dollar amount of $20, but that's going to be a lot less than the 200%. But also you're going to be giving a lot of short rides where you could be getting bonus amounts, in the teens, up to $20 for a ride that you may go maybe even a mile. So often drivers may even dread those long rides. Yeah, you're going to get paid a good fare for them, but you're going to get taken away from the heat zone. Also, you're not going to get paid a percentage-based prime time rate. You're going to get paid a fixed dollar amount, where it would have made sense for you just to give that passenger a 2-mile ride as opposed to a 20-plus mile ride. But quite frankly, we don't know how Lyft is going to be handling those long rides, because in Chicago they still have the old prime time and the new heat map experience in place. So we don't know what passengers are actually going to be charged. Are they going to be charged fixed dollar amounts? Are they still going to be charged a percentage? We still don't know that. And again, Lyft paused that experiment in Chicago. And they also actually sent us a statement in response to Mark's article over at therideshareguide.com, basically ensuring that they appreciate the candid feedback and that they're working hard to address any and all concerns ahead of a broader rollout of the new version of Primetime. But we've heard that a lot of drivers aren't really happy with this new fixed dollar amount Primetime idea. Let us know in the comments what you think. Have you experienced the new version, the new heat maps? If you haven't subscribed to the Rideshare Guide channel, please subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and drive safe. Thanks.